biographical research. So, in terms of writing the biographical research, it's actually one of the most used research methodologies in qualitative research because for one thing, it's by far the easiest thing to do. Also, it highlights the idea of using only a singular respondent slash informant to center the study data into. So, in doing the biographical research, we don't necessarily have to provide ourselves with a wide number of respondents. Rather, in the biographical research, we highlight more on the intellectual life of a person and on the intellectual life of an esteemed personage or essentially a person who may have had a high reputation in terms of other fields, like for example in education, in curriculum, in politics and governance, in culture, in history, in society, and so on and so forth. So, in writing the biographical research, we highlight the correlation of one of the easiest genres that most probably you already learned in your previous lessons, most probably in academic writing and so on and so forth. So, biography. In the matter of biography, we talk about the dynamics on how it can be reapplied into various forms. Let's say, for example, the autobiography, the memoir, and of course, the narrative research. So, in these three respects, the idea of the biography, in itself already, is only a presentation on the intellectual life of a single person that has a tantamount reputation in terms of reputation in terms of the field in which he or she may have delved into. So, moving on into the biographical research, it actually appears in 5 formats. So one of the usual formats in doing a biographical research is of course beginning with a scholarly chronicle. A scholarly chronicle centers on the works of a certain academician. Let's say, for example, let's put the idea of the Atenean / Polytechnic University of the Philippines literary critic and the recently deceased Adel Garceliano. So Adel Garceliano is actually known as one of the most influential literary critics here in the Philippines, as well as in other countries, and of course hailed in other international organizations as well. So Adel Garceliano was known for his works pertaining to the idea of literature as not necessarily limited to the idea of national literature, but rather literature should appear in the dynamisms and of course the variety of its forms. Meaning to say, in terms of the individual representation of various writers, it does not necessarily have to cohere to a certain standard just for the sake of national identity. Rather, these varieties, these diverse personalities of Filipino writers already define what Philippine literature means. This is actually one of the most important realizations that Adel Garceliano might have taught the Filipino people, and of course, in the whole general, the Filipino writing public, and of course, the literary community. So, in a scholarly, going back to the scholarly chronicle, the scholarly chronicle focuses more on the works, the most famous works, the most outstanding crafts, the most outstanding statements, anything that goes beyond the personality, of the academician himself. Rather, in the scholarly chronicle, it centers solely on the work. It centers solely on the output. It centers solely on what the scholar or what the academician might have produced during his or her time when lecturing, or in terms of her intellectual reputation. So, moving forward, the other matter, of course, is intellectual biography. So, in comparison to the scholarly chronicle, the intellectual biography focuses more on the mind, or essentially the wavelength of arguments, or the patternization of arguments in which the subject or the informant might have possessed. Like for example, let's take the so like for example let's take the idea of Karl Marx in terms of how he attempted to redefine all the philosophies of the world and essentially brand them as bourgeois idealism. Rather, he pertained to the idea that all schools of thought might have been done for the sake of personal desires, and of course being politicized to a point that religion might have represented itself in various philosophies, which might explain why religion has a very high reputation when it comes to philosophical studies. But nevertheless, the intellectual biography focuses more on the patterns of thinking, the wavelength, the mind itself, the quality of the mind of the subject itself. It focuses solely on the pattern of thinking that has been influential for the author. Like for example, let's put another scholar slash philosopher into play. For example, Slavoj Zizek is actually one of the most interesting and by far one of the most growing influential Marxists during the modern time, during these modern times, because usually Slavoj Zizek's approach is directly comparing various film scenarios into philosophical critiques, citing Hegel, citing Marx, citing Derrida, and others like that. So by doing so, Slavoj Zizek focused more on redefining pop culture, and of course how he managed to relate early stage philosophies that might have hidden itself, or might have buried itself rather, subconsciously in various superficial modern culture, or as we would like to call it, pop culture, which is why for most people, culture studies actually recognize Slavoj Zizek as one of the most relatable philosophers in these current times. Why? Because of his ability to actually relate what is trending to what is philosophically correct, what is politically correct, and whatnot. And of course, one of his controversial points of view centers on the death of ideology, saying that the technological advances, as well as the currently antisocial construct that society develops, removing people from social connections and interactions whatsoever. It's actually an act of the death of ideology, because it pertains to the death of the practice of discourse. That's how he explained it. In most of his books. I would like to cite the book of the newly written book of Slavoj Zizek, Panic and the Pandemic. COVID-19 shakes the world. In this respect, Slavoj Zizek presented various representations on the culture that existed in the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course the relations to what social actions might be necessary in terms of alleviating the crisis in the whole. So, going back to the intellectual biography, we go to the mind, the quality of the mind, the wavelength, and of course the pattern of thought, the ways of thinking in which the philosopher or the author or the subject slash the informant might have produced, which by far would make him a distinct personage in the research. So, moving forward, let's go to the next one. Let's go to the life history. In life history writing, this is by far one of the most one of the most basic forms of biographical research, because by far this is the lightest as so far. In this respect, the life history writing presents life history writing presents a life outline. The life outline is somehow related to the combination of his or her achievements, the origin, his place of origin, um, other educational attainments, other published works, and others like that. So, in life history, here we see the evolution of the informant as time went by. Like for example, let's use the idea of Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens was initially exposed to the ills of English society, which by far influenced him to write various literary forms that actually presented, or actually exposed rather, the various, what should I call it? The various oppressive forms in which English people actually experience. Like for example, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol presented the obvious divide of the context of a Christmas celebration as celebrated by those who are fortunate compared to those who are less fortunate, and by far presents us with a grim realization that of course the unfortunate families might not have might have been presented as already being in a perilous state. Therefore, in A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens presented an even deeper appreciation as well as awareness to the unfortunate class, of course to the marginalized sector that was present during his time there. So, with that being said, the life history of Charles Dickens may actually be stemmed through his family, through his experiences from his family, through his experiences from various adventures, through his experiences from various people, and others like that. So, in terms of doing so, the life history background actually presents us with a life outline in which the informant evolves his ways of thinking. He suddenly has this idea of learning how to debunk his former ideas and turn them into something better, into a better realization that serves a greater purpose. I would also like to cite the ideas of Stephen Hawking. He actually posted a lot of papers that he himself actually debunked. So in that respect, Stephen Hawking might have presented himself as someone who has continuously evolving ideas, in which it could be possible for most people, especially for him, to immediately debunk because of the continuously changing environment and the continuously changing circumstances. So that's how you write the life history research. So let's go to the memoir biography. In the memoir biography, we go simply to the act of lauding. We laud the informant in terms of the major achievements that come from most of his outputs and most of the fruits that come from the informant's career. So in the memoir, this is usually done for those who have actually passed away. Let's say for example, Adelaide Staliano, Mahatma Gandhi, who else? Paulo Freire, and others like that. So In the memoir biography, this is actually one of the most sentimental forms of biographical research and by far the most difficult to do. Why? Because there is a tendency that the researcher might get lost into the sentiment and therefore might be totally biased in terms of presenting various data, in terms of putting or rather dominating his or her personal interpretations instead of comparing it and properly synthesizing it with the text that he is actually presented with. So, with the memoir biography, it's actually one of the it's actually a dedication research, if I were to put it, a dedication research in which it highlights the major accomplishments of certain informants, especially those who have high reputations. Now, to go to the last one, we will present ourselves with the narrative biography. Now, what puts narrative biography apart from all of the biographical researches is, of course, the authentic access to the narrative, the authentic access to actual narratives that come from people. I would like to cite the works of Professor Jason Irizarry in terms of his participatory action research entitled Latinization of U.S. Schools. So, he presented a research paper in terms of how the Latin American community, as well as other races that are present inside American schools, what types of discrimination did they face, whom did they receive it from, and others like that. So, what did Professor Irizarry use in the research as subjects? He simply made use of the narratives that came from actual students themselves. Given the nature that it is a participatory action research, the students themselves or the informants themselves were the ones who practically presented their own narratives through forms of research writing. This is by far one of the greatest breakthroughs that I, for one, as a researcher, actually look up to. Because for one thing, we actually learn how to include research and how to make it relevant for the informant, the direct beneficiary, and whatnot. So, Professor Irizarry presented various narratives that came from various Latin American students, and with all of them, they presented their findings as having experienced discrimination not only from students but from teachers as well. And of course, what strengthens this discrimination even more is the idea of academic apartheid. The idea of academic apartheid in which schools of thought or academic resources are somehow limited to the Latin American community just only because of the fact that they are Latin Americans and not purely Americans, or if I were to refer to it, the whites, or essentially white Americans. So, in that academic apartheid, various Latin American students actually faced heavy discrimination, and of course, has been presented with challenges, but most of them actually admitted of attempting to drop from school, to not pursue their education any further, and others like that. So of course, what Professor Irizarry presents in these narratives is the realization that the Latin American community are actually self-aware. They have this self-awareness that makes them all more relevant and actually are able to present their ideas in an intelligible and comprehensive structure in which can be appreciated by the academic community. So, with that respect, that's how the narrative biography is written. The narrative biography centers more on the narratives coming from the informants, coming from the actual subjects themselves. So, in whole, this is how you write the biographical research in all forms. You could use 2 to 3. You could also use only one informant at most, so that you would have an in-depth study on the character. You could actually use a lot of related articles, like for example memoirs, autobiographies, other articles, news articles, feature articles concerning your respondent and others like that. So, with that being said, the biographical research is essentially the amalgamation and the academization of what we would like to call the most profound school of thought. What is authentic and what can be realizable by the normal though. So, that concludes this lecture. If you think this lecture has been helpful for you, please do not hesitate to leave a like on this video. And of course, if you think this might help other people, please do not hesitate to share this video to them as well. So, that being said, thank you very much for watching. And of course, stay safe and sanitary.